Yeah, and with Keller, and again, my wife was converted reading Tim Keller. He was probably my single favorite preacher for several years. I've listened to hundreds of his sermons. I've read a bunch of his stuff. I've benefited greatly from Keller. I mean, all kinds of things I've said and things I believe have come from Keller. I mean, so I'm not discounting all of his ministry, but I will say that, I mean, it's coming from a guy who, like, I was a diehard Tim Keller fan. I don't think you even understand how much I was a huge Keller fan 10 or so years ago. But I'll just say, so it pains me to have to say this kind of stuff, but about Keller, I have major concerns. Okay, let me even step back an inch from where you're at, because I agree with what you're saying. Stepping back even to the big picture, my concern with Keller is really his entire approach of how to do ministry. You say, what do you mean? He ministers in New York City, and I know he has cancer now. He's got pancreatic cancer. He's probably not going to live much longer. I know that, and I don't doubt that he's a believer. You know, I do think he knows and loves the Lord, and I'm not doubting any of that. And I pray for him. I hope, I hope him well, physically, spiritually, all those things. I try to keep up even with how he's doing in terms of treatment. All that to say, I have major concerns with his approach to the culture. Let me just mention some things. It's kind of summing up some things we talked about throughout the whole culture series with using him. In New York City, there have been, you can look at the stats. Most years over the last decade, there have been more African American babies aborted than born alive. Each year in New York City in the last 10 years. You don't believe me? Look it up. Thousands of more babies, African American babies, are murdered in the womb than born alive every year in New York City. That is a fact. Google it and look it up. Tim Keller preaches in a megachurch. Or at least I know he's retired now. He still ministers, but he's retired. But he preached at this megachurch from like 1989 until just a few years ago. 5,000 people. It grew to 5,000 people. At 9/11, his church doubled in size that week. Because 9/11 happened, everyone was terrified. They wanted hope. They went to his church. His church doubled. His church went to like 3,000 people overnight. And a lot of people, I think, were genuinely converted under his ministry. He preached the gospel many times. But here's the thing. You're in like the number one abortion provider in our country, New York City. You're a pastor. Like, you're supposed to be a prophetic voice of truth and justice. He writes a whole book on justice issues in the Bible. He only mentions abortion on one page, because I've looked it up. He only mentions abortion once, and he doesn't even directly talk about it. He uses it as an illustration about something else. Okay, now just think about this. You write a book on justice, and he says his target audience is New York City. You're a pastor of a church of 5,000 in Manhattan, and you write a book on justice. What's the number one injustice going on in New York City? Killing unborn babies. That's the number one injustice. Has he ever preached a sermon on abortion? No. Has he ever mentioned an abortion any more than in passing in the whole book on justice written for the city? He never says a word about it. Instead, he focuses on basically socialism, redistributionary financial policies that the culture loves right now. He sounds a lot like the culture when he talks about justice. He doesn't. That's why the Washington Post gets him to do articles, and New York Times will do articles on Tim Keller. Why? Because he's not very offensive. When it comes to the things that the culture will shut you down on, he is radio silence. You Google his question about homosexuality. It's got like 2 million views. Now, I grant you, he publicly apologized for his answer because it was terrible. He said it was awful. He said it was fear of man. He was in a huge forum in New York City. I think it was New York City. Thousands of people in this huge auditorium. It was a Veritas forum. Mm-hmm. He's getting a live Q&A, back and forth. He gets asked about, will unrepentant homosexuals go to hell? Which I grant you, that's the hardest question you can be asked in Manhattan. And what does he do? He does everything he can to not answer the question for 6 minutes straight. It is a painful thing to watch. You go look at it. It's got 2 million views, I think, on YouTube. What does he say? He says, well, this is one part of his answer. I know homosexuality doesn't send you to hell because heterosexuality won't send me to heaven. What? He knows the answer to the question, doesn't he? This guy is as smart as they get. He is a very intelligent and well-read man, and I love him, and my wife was converted reading him, okay? I owe a great debt to this man. But why are you I think the way he frames things and what he chooses to talk about and what he chooses to ignore is based on his view of how to address culture, which frankly it's closer to a seeker-sensitive model than it is to biblical faithfulness. I think he knows if he comes out and just says what Scripture says about sexuality or about abortion, he's going to get steam trained. He's just going to get run over in Manhattan. His ministry will be, he's never going to appear on the Morning Joe anymore like he has. The Morning Joe host, I think, goes to his church, and the guy supports abortion, which is confusing to me. But I mean, you see all this kind of stuff where, why aren't you more clear on the obvious, clear, basic stuff? And then when it comes to the justice issue, you get into the thing that sounds very much like our culture sounds right now. And He has a whole book on how to do church. It's called Center Church, I think, or City Church, or Center Church.
Center
It's a
Church,
huge hardcover book. He wrote the whole thing. It's this massive textbook on how to do church. And I haven't read all of it. It's a gigantic book. But the impression you get reading through at least parts of it that I've read, he basically says, and this is one of his approaches, if you want to talk about something that you know the culture is going to hate, he calls this he calls it like a B doctrine, a doctrine the culture will hate. He says, never address a B doctrine that the culture hates unless you can somehow tie it to an A doctrine that the culture loves. Now, there's a degree of practical wisdom to what he's saying. If you can tie things together and show, okay, that's fine, that could be persuasive. But do you know that there are certain B doctrines, certain negative doctrines that you can't in any way make look attractive in our culture? You cannot go on MSNBC and make it sound good because he's been on different shows. And when you go, so what happens when the doctrine, you can't make it look good? You know what you do? You don't talk about it. And that, to me, is what breaks my heart. Like, this guy is so sharp and so well-read, and I just wish there was more of a courage when it came to the stuff that's just not popular. But he just is so careful not to put his hand on the stove. You know, he knows what will happen. So he just dances around it. And again, I'm repeating myself now, but he writes a whole book on justice to New York City and doesn't mention the thing that is by far the greatest injustice in New York City. And that, to me, and I love the man, but that is a failure of courage. And I know he knows that the cost will be huge, but you can't let that determine what you say. John the Baptist could have avoided prison and beheading by avoiding one sentence in his preaching. He could have just said to Herod that his sexual immorality was not sexual morality. Herod, it's okay for you to sleep with what was his brother's wife. It's okay. You take Philip's wife. If John the Baptist had removed one sentence about sexual morality from his sermon, he would not have gone to jail. He would not have died young. He could have, I mean, a Keller argument would be just leave that part out. Just don't say that directly because you're going to go to jail. You're going to lose your life. You could have a whole fruitful ministry for 30 more years. You're 30. Why would you lose that? And yet he says, no, I'm going to be faithful. And he goes to jail and he gets killed for saying one sentence about sexual morality publicly. And I think today is the day for courage. I think every day is the day for courage. But in our culture today, it is the time for courage amongst God's people. It is not the time to be timid, fearing man, afraid of offending, doing everything we can to bend Scripture to where we don't say anything that's overly, upsetting to anyone. And I could say more, but those are some of even the big picture troubling things, not to mention all of what you just discussed, which is equally upsetting.
Yeah, wow, yeah, that's... And again, we talk about this, and we don't I don't get excited to disagree with Keller. I don't get excited about, having to disagree with Eric Mason and David Platt and, all the other guys. It's not like this is something I get a thrill out of. It's a necessity because these are influential people who influence, to use a modern term, they influence the influencers. They're the ones who it trickles down into to the articles we read, the books we read, the people we listen to on podcasts. Folks like Mason, Keller, Platt, others, they're the ones that are having the effect on all that we're hearing. And so we have to address this with tears, with grief, and more.
And just one more thing on that, because you mentioned this to me a couple weeks ago. The guys and the men and women who are being discipled by some of these guys, I'm even more concerned about where they may go one day, because that's even more troubling to me is what kind of person are you producing if the sensitivity to offending culture becomes a non-negotiable? If that's a non-negotiable in how you're supposed to be a pastor, that's going to produce a certain kind of pastor, right? If it's never ever touch this issue in a certain way because it's going to get you in trouble, then it's going to produce a whole group. I mean, again, Keller discipled me without knowing me. He's discipled many, many people, and my fear is that some will buy into the don't offend in certain ways premise, and not that he says it that way, but that's the effect. And that I'm concerned about where that's going to go in the next generation.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely agree. Oftentimes our children will take our positions that we have in moderation and go a whole lot further with them, which again is why we have to be so careful with what we teach. Okay, for time's sake, we're going to move on to this last book here. This is one of many books introducing critical race theory. I'm going to read what they call critical race theory. There's 5 major tenets, And I want you to go back in your mind to all that we've talked about, all that we've listened to. A lot of these folks, they would publicly say, oh, I don't believe in critical race theory, See if what these guys are saying is what you hear these guys saying.
And as you're opening that, let me just reemphasize that today CRT has become a negative word for a lot of people. Even non-Christians hear it and they're like, I don't like. A lot of people don't like the term critical race theory. Even public schools say we don't teach that anymore. And have y'all seen these undercover videos where they interview staff at different public schools? And these are interesting. In a private, they don't know they're being recorded. I've seen all kinds of leaders and faculty and principals say on camera, like numerous videos are out. You can look them up in schools in America, where the person will go, yeah, we say we don't put critical race theory in our curriculum, which is true. But we still teach the premises in our classrooms. And they said this on video. So someone now knows not to use it. People are scared of the term critical race theory. That's kind of the boogeyman term. But now they'll just take the concepts and repackage them
Right.
under new labels. And that's what's happening even right now. People are starting to repackage some of this.
Yeah. All right. So, like I said, one of the things that is so helpful to do is let people speak for themselves. I don't want my interpretation of this to color. I want them to say this. So here we go. This is basic tenets of critical race theory according to one of their seminal textbooks. First, racism is ordinary, not aberrational, quote unquote normal science, the usual way society does business, the common everyday experience of most people of color in this country. Full stop. That has underlined every single thing we've dealt with in this series in reference to social justice, wokeness, and all of that.
What
Is
did
that assumption.
David Platt, the clip I just showed, what did he say? You don't think that you're a racist because you don't feel prejudice towards other people of different ethnicities, but you don't realize this. You are immersed in racism. That is a premise of critical race theory, even though David Platt would not say he believes